The mill had been silent for 11 days when Petra Scholl arrived in Harwick with nothing but a canvas bag, a set of carving knives wrapped in oilcloth, and a letter from a dead man. She had not planned to stay. The letter was from her uncle, Otto Scholl, who had written it 3 weeks before a fever took him, and in it he had asked her to come settle his affairs. A modest sawmill on the eastern edge of Harwick, Montana, a mule named Clarence, and a debt of $240 owed to a man named Cutter Haynes. Otto had no children. Petra was the only family he had left in this country, and so she came, alone, 2 days by rail from Billings, and half a day by wagon from the station at Grover's Crossing. Harwick was smaller than she expected. One main road, packed dirt that turned to mud at the first sign of weather. A general store, a livery, a church with a bell that had cracked sometime in the past decade and never been replaced. A boarding house run by a woman named Dot Selby, who had the steady eyes of someone who had learned not to be surprised by much. "You're Otto's niece," Dot said when Petra knocked. It wasn't a question. "I am." Dot looked at the canvas bag, then at Petra's hands. "Come in, then. Supper's in an hour." The mill sat at the end of a rutted track off the main road, backed up against a creek that ran fast and cold out of the hills. It was a good sight. Otto had known what he was doing when he built it, 20 years ago. With timber he'd felled himself, and a wheel he'd had shipped from St. Louis. The wheel still turned. The blade was sound. What the mill lacked was a miller, because Otto was gone, and the 2 men who had worked for him had moved on within a week of his death, having wages to think about and families to feed. Petra stood in the empty mill for a long time that first evening, listening to the water move under the wheel. She had grown up watching her father work wood in a small shop in Pennsylvania. She had learned to read grain and set a blade before she was 12. She had married at 22, been widowed at 26 when her husband sickened and died in the same year the crops failed, and had spent the 3 years since then working in her cousin's furniture shop in Billings, sanding, finishing, taking apart what other people had broken and putting it back together. She was 30 years old. She knew how to work. What she did not know was how badly Cutter Haynes wanted that mill. She found out on the 3rd day. She had been at the mill since dawn, going through Otto's records, learning what timber contracts he'd had and which had lapsed since his death. The books were kept in a tin box under the workbench, and they were honest. Otto had always been methodical, but they showed a business that had been thinning for 2 years. Not failing, not yet, but leaning. She was still reading when she heard boots on the plank floor and looked up to find a man in the doorway, heavy-set, with a sheepskin coat and the easy posture of someone accustomed to walking into rooms uninvited. "You'd be the niece," he said. "Petra Scholl, Cutter Haynes." He came the rest of the way in without being asked, looked around the mill with the assessing eyes of a buyer at auction. "Your uncle owed me $240. I expect you know that. I know it. Due at the end of the month. I know that too." He nodded slowly as if she'd said something agreeable. "Now, I don't want to make this hard on you. I understand you've had a loss, but I also run a business, and a debt's a debt." He paused. "What I'm prepared to offer is this. You sign the mill over to me, I'll call the debt settled, and you can be on the train back to wherever you came from by the end of the week." Petra set down the ledger. She looked at him steadily. "The mill is worth 4 times what he owed you. A mill with no miller and no contracts isn't worth much of anything. I'm a miller." Haynes smiled, not unkindly. "No offense meant, Miss Scholl, but this is Montana. Timber work is men's work, and the men in this town know me. They'll bring their logs to my yard. That's possible," Petra said. "But I'm not going anywhere, so I suppose we'll see." Haynes held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked out without another word. Petra sat still for a while after he left. She looked at the wheel turning in the current, at the blade waiting in its housing, at the stacks of unsawn timber her uncle had taken in on credit before he died. Then she opened the ledger again and kept reading. The first person in Harwick who treated her like someone worth talking to was a boy named Sam Pryor. He was 12, maybe 13, with mud on his boots year-round, and a habit of appearing at the mill in the early mornings before school. The first time, Petra thought he was there to look at the machinery. The second time, she realized he was there to watch her work. "My father had a sawmill," he said one morning from the doorway, "in Oregon. Before we came here. What happened to it?" Flood took it. He watched her adjust the blade tension. "You're doing that wrong." Petra stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "The tension. My father always said you set it too tight. The blade'll walk. You want it snug, not stiff. He came closer, pointed without touching. Right there. Petra looked at the blade. She looked at the boy. Then she loosened the tension 2 turns, as he suggested. The first cut ran clean and true. Your father taught you well, she said. Sam shrugged. He taught me everything before the flood. After that, he came most mornings, and she didn't tell him to stop. He knew things about the mill that weren't in Otto's ledger. Which of the local farmers had timber to move? Which ones had been waiting for someone reliable to open the mill again? Which ones had taken their business to Haynes's yard in the next county, only because they'd had no other choice? Mr. Raines has got 40 logs sitting in his south field, Sam said one Tuesday. Been there since September. He asked Mr. Haynes to send a wagon, and the wagon never came. Where does Raines live? Half-mile out the Sutter Road. Red Barn. You can't miss it. Petra finished the cut she was making and brushed the sawdust from her sleeves. Go to school, she told Sam. Then she hitched the mule and drove out the Sutter Road. August Raines was a tall, spare man in his 60s who came to his own door with a rifle, saw Petra, and put the rifle down again with a look of mild embarrassment. I'm Petra Scholl, she said, Otto Scholl's niece. I've taken over the mill. Raines looked at her for a moment. You have you? I have. I understand you have timber you need milled. He was quiet. She waited because she had learned from her father that some men needed time to arrive at a thing. 43 logs, he said finally. White pine, mostly. I was hoping to have boards by November. He looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to say something rude. I don't mean to be unkind, but you know what you're doing? I do. She met his eyes. Come by the mill tomorrow morning and watch me work for an hour. If you don't like what you see, you can haul your logs to Haynes, and I won't say a word about it. Raines thought about it. All right, he said. 8 o'clock. He came at 7:30, and he stayed until noon. He watched her set the blade, read the grain, make the first cut on a timber that had been giving her trouble since Monday. He watched her work through a problem mid-cut, without stopping, without wasting the board. He said nothing until she turned off the wheel, and the noise of the creek returned. Otto never mentioned you, he said. He was a modest man. Raines almost smiled. I'll bring the first load Friday. Word got around the way word does in a small town, not all at once, but steadily, like water finding its level. By the end of October, Petra had 4 timber contracts. Not enough, not yet, but enough to keep the blade running and the wheel turning, and enough to begin paying down what Otto had owed. She was not warm. Exactly. She didn't have the time for warm. But she was fair, she was punctual, and she never gave anyone a board that wasn't what they'd ordered. In a place where business ran on trust, those things were not small. Dot Selby's boarding house had 6 rooms, and by November 3 of them were empty. The other 2, besides Petra's, belonged to a retired assayer named Harold Fisk, who took his meals quietly and was no trouble, and a woman named Celia Marsh, who was passing through to Oregon and had been passing through for 4 months, delayed by a combination of weather and a stubborn reluctance to leave a place that suited her. Celia was perhaps 45, a small woman with sharp eyes and a gift for arriving in a room at exactly the right moment. She and Petra had established a quiet, mutual respect over the supper table, based primarily on the fact that neither of them spoke more than necessary. One evening in November, Celia sat across from Petra after the other 2 had gone to bed, and set a cup of coffee in front of her, without being asked. Haynes has been talking, Celia said. Petra looked up from the contract she was reading. About what? About you. About the mill. Celia wrapped her hands around her own cup. He's telling people that Otto's debt comes due December 1st, and that when you can't pay, the mill reverts to him. He's already told the Grover brothers you won't be open come January. The debt is December 1st, Petra said. But I'll have it. Will you? Petra looked down at the contract. I'll have most of it. Celia said nothing. Petra appreciated that about her. Some people, when they heard a problem stated plainly, couldn't resist offering solutions. Celia simply received the information and let it sit. How much short? Celia asked, after a while. $60. Maybe less if the Raines delivery comes in this week. Celia nodded. She looked at her coffee. You know, before I was passing through, I kept books for a timber operation in Missouri. 12 years. She said it the way a person states a fact, not looking for anything in return. If you wanted someone to look at the ledger, I could do that. Fresh eyes sometimes find things. Petra looked at her for a moment. Then she went and got the tin box. Celia found 3 billing errors that had slipped past Petra. Not large ones, but enough that when corrected and collected, they closed the gap to $30. Petra drove out to August Rains and asked if he could advance half the payment on the order she was filling. Rains looked at her for a moment, then wrote her a check without asking why she needed it. Otto was a good man, he said, handing it over. I'd rather have his niece milling my timber than sell to Haynes. $30 remained. On the 28th of November, Sam Pryor appeared at the mill after school with a dented coffee tin. He set it on the workbench without saying anything and pushed it toward her. Petra looked at the tin, then at the boy. What is this? Mr. Raines sent some, and the Devlin brothers, and Harvey Kurtz, and some others. Sam's voice was matter of fact, the way a child's voice is, when they're repeating something an adult told them to say, and they're trying to get it right. They said to tell you that a town needs a mill more than it needs Cutter Haynes. Petra did not open the tin right away. She stood there a moment, her hands still. How many people? She asked. 7, I think. Maybe 8. Harvey's wife put in some too, but he didn't know if you'd want him to say that. She opened the tin. Inside was $38 and some cents in various coins and bills, folded and rolled and pressed together. Petra set the lid back on the tin. She looked at the wheel turning in the water. Then she looked at the boy. Tell them, she said, that I'll remember this. Mr. Raines said you'd say something like that. Sam picked up his school bag. He said to tell you he doesn't want you to remember it. He just wants his boards by Christmas. On December 1st, Petra Scholl walked into Cutter Haynes's office at the back of the Harwick Land and Loan Building and set $240 on his desk. Coin and paper, counted out and bundled, and she had counted it twice before she came. Haynes looked at the money for a long moment. He looked at her. You're short, he said. Count it. He counted it. He was not short. Haynes set the money down. He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his face showed something. Not anger, not quite, but something in the neighborhood of it. Then it smoothed over. All right, he said. I'll need a receipt. He wrote one out. She checked it, folded it, put it in her coat. Then she turned and walked out of the office, back through the Land and Loan Building, out into the cold December street, where the sky was the color of pewter and the first snow of the season was beginning to fall in small, dry flakes. She stood there for a moment, in the street, the snow coming down around her, and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, not exactly, but something quieter and more durable than that. The kind of feeling that comes when a thing you have been holding yourself against finally gives way. Then she walked back to the mill to finish the Raines order. Christmas in Harwick was modest, as it was every year. Dot Selby put a wreath on the boarding house door. The cracked church bell rang anyway. It had always rung, crack and all, and the congregation had decided long ago that they preferred the familiar sound to silence. August Raines brought a bottle of rye to the mill on Christmas Eve and left it on the workbench with a note that said only well done, in handwriting so careful it might have been traced. Sam Pryor came by on Christmas morning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a blade wrench, a good one, with a carved handle, the kind of thing a person makes when they have spent time watching someone work and have noticed what they reach for most. Did you make this? Petra asked. My father's tools are in the barn, Sam said. I don't use them much. But I thought, he stopped. It's the best blade wrench I've ever held, Petra said. She meant it. Sam looked at the floor. He was 12 years old and doing his best not to show that he was pleased. My father always said the handle matters as much as the head, he said. If it doesn't fit your hand, you'll fight it. He was right. By the spring, the mill was running 5 days a week. She'd taken on a man named Devlin, the younger of the two brothers, who knew timber and arrived on time and didn't ask unnecessary questions, which were the 3 things Petra required of anyone who worked for her. She had settled Otto's estate, cleared the remaining small debts, and filed the title on the mill in her own name at the county seat in March. Celia Marsh, who had been passing through to Oregon for 6 months, wrote a letter to her sister in Portland explaining that she had decided to stay in Harwick a while longer. She was keeping books for the mill and had taken over the empty room next to Harold Fisk's, and she had negotiated a lower rate from Dot Selby by offering to keep the boarding house accounts as well. You're not going to Oregon, Petra said one evening. I might still, Celia said, without looking up from the ledger. You're not. Celia made a mark in the column. The weather might improve. Petra said nothing. It was April. The weather had already improved. In May, Cutter Haynes made one more attempt. He came to the mill on a Tuesday morning, not to the mill directly, but to August Raines first, with an offer for Raines's timber at a rate Petra couldn't match. Raines listened to the offer. He said he would think about it. Then he drove out to the mill and told Petra exactly what Haines had proposed. Petra thought about it for the length of a board, which was long enough. "I can't match his price right now," she said, "but I can match it by fall if the Caldwell order comes through, and I'll put that in writing." Raines folded his arms. "I don't need it in writing," he said. "I told you. I'd rather have his niece milling my timber." After that, Haines didn't come back. Not to Petra, not to the other contract holders. He had a yard in the next county and enough business there, and whatever calculation he ran on Harwick came out in favor of letting it alone. Petra did not celebrate this. She didn't think of it as a victory so much as a settling, the town finding its own level again, the way water does after something has disturbed it. What she thought about, later, when the business of the mill had become ordinary, and the extraordinary part of the past year had receded enough to look at clearly, was not Haines, or the debt, or the December walk across the cold street. She thought about August Raines, who had come at 7:30 when she'd asked for 8 and stayed until noon. She thought about Sam Pryor and the blade wrench with the carved handle. She thought about Celia sitting across the supper table with a cup of coffee she hadn't been asked for, saying fresh eyes sometimes find things, not offering charity, offering her actual skill. She thought about how a place becomes a place, not by having a church or a livery or a main road, but by having people who show up for each other in the small, ordinary ways that don't get recorded anywhere. Otto had known that. He had been part of this town for 20 years, had built something here that outlasted him, and what he had left behind was not just a mill but a web of small obligations and small trusts that she had not been able to see from outside. She had walked into it as a stranger, and somewhere between August Raines's 8 o'clock appointment and the dented coffee tin on the workbench, she had stopped being one. The mill ran. The wheel turned. The water moved fast and cold out of the hills, the same as it always had, and would long after any of them were gone. She was not unhappy. That was not a small thing out here. It was, in fact, just about everything.